we hear in our high school history classes, when they give their minute and a half to this subject, they'll say, well, you can't compare white bondage to black slavery because the whites didn't do very difficult work and the enslavement was all over with within 7 years. No way. There were many loopholes and abuses of that law. As you and I know, there can be a law on a piece of paper. That doesn't mean that that's what's lived or brought into action. And for example, if you were a white slave and you did work that was unsuitable, or if you tried to run away, how were they penalized? In some cases by whippings, very onerous whippings. I have found accounts of almost fatal doses of whippings. There's been the recent firestorm of hysteria about this Jewish teenager who was to be caned in Singapore. I believe it was 7 cane strokes, and he was ultimately administered 4. Well, white slaves had to endure hundreds of lashes, and many of them died of that. But another way of penalizing them was to add time onto their length of service. If you ran away a day, that was a month of additional service. If you ran away for a month, that was a year of additional service. If you stole from your master, that could be months of additional service. If you had a corrupt master, and the courts of assize listened more to the master than they did to you, he could have all kinds of trumped-up charges against you, as happened in the Caribbean, and has happened in the United States in the tobacco plantations, and it meant that in reality it boiled down to a lifetime of enslavement under the euphemism of indentures.
Now, were these people allowed to marry and have children?
No. A white woman who had a child out of wedlock because she was not allowed to marry, so any child she did have would be out of wedlock. If it was a male child, that child became a slave until the age of majority, and the age of majority was 21 for males, and a female issue from that woman would be a slave unto that woman's master until the white child was 18.
Now, where did these slaves come from? Where were they drawn from?
Well, primarily from Great Britain. It was remarked in one of the chronicles that I found that Scotland was a veritable industry for white slavery. In the 17th century, white parents were afraid to bring their children to the ports of Scotland for fear of what has come to be known as press gangs. Again, the historians have distorted this and implied that impressment only operated for recruiting people on board British men of war as sailors. That's not true. In the original annals, you find that press gangs operated to kidnap children and adults on board these ships, and it was a veritable industry with the cooperation of the authorities. It began in the very early or the very late Elizabethan era, when the Elizabethan geographer Halkut suggested that the only way they were going to people these plantations was with bondsmen. But the actual machinery of it and where it was really put into effect en masse came in the Stuart dynasty and under the King Charles I in the early 17th century.
Now, that is not exactly a nice part of Western history then.
Well, it is in a sense that it may be an indictment of the ruling class, but if you study the heroism of the white slave, I don't think that it is necessarily a depressing chronicle, because these people had tremendous spirit. And in the end, the reason why the slavers in the British America switched from whites to blacks is that white slaves were virtually in constant rebellion. As I chronicle in my book, they were white and they were slaves. There were really countless rebellions against bondage. And after a while, when they had a large enough black population in colonial America, they figured we better switch from the whites to the blacks. Now, I'm not suggesting that was a general, coincidental, synchronistic decision that all of them made together as kind of a cabal or a conspiracy. It was nothing so conspiratorial. It was very informal. But in general, there was a perception that whites were much more independent and rebellious than the blacks.
Now, this kind of indentured labor force, was it freed when America gained its independence and the British lost kind of the right to rule, or when did this practice end?
They were not granted their freedom under the United States Constitution, because there is a reference in the Constitution to bondsmen of unspecified races, and there were still people profiting from white bondage. What did end with the beginning of the American Revolutionary War against the British Crown was transportation, which is a technical term used by the British for bringing so-called white criminals from Britain and dumping them in the United States. Benjamin Franklin greatly protested that, and that was in fact one of the colonists' grievances. However, I believe that it was also an alibi because the Waltham Black Act of 1723 had criminalized a great number of petty misdemeanors and made them capital offenses. In other words, Britain was teeming with a white population of poor people that it couldn't handle, and it needed to get them off the island. So by criminalizing these petty offenses, you were then able to say, we sentence you to death. However, as for stealing a teaspoon, or a loaf of bread, or cutting down trees on an aristocrat's grounds, or poaching a deer. However, as a mercy of the British Crown, we will transport you for life into slavery in the British Crown colony of America. When the American Revolution erupted, the British Crown then had to switch their dumping ground from America to Australia. And certain fortunate whites, as well as fortunate blacks, because there were also free blacks who owned whites, free blacks who owned blacks, and blacks who were involved in an indentured system that was very humane and legitimate, that I'm outlining here. So it's a much more complex topic.
When we talk about slavery, we talk about these crowded ships coming over from Africa with people dying of diseases, people being kept in the holds of these primitive ships. Was it the same for whites?
It was worse for whites because the ships were not designed to carry human cargo as the slave ships were. They were designed to carry cargo, period, which could be horses, it could be rum, it could be lumber. These ships exhibited a higher rate of fatality for white slaves, as I document in my book, in the Middle Passage, as it's known, than existed for black slaves.
Another topic that you raise is that Indians, North American Indians, actually had slaves.
Yes, the so-called civilized tribes, the Cherokee and the Choctaw, had slave plantations, and they kept black slaves on those plantations in the South. And this is where the black cowboy phenomenon comes that's now being celebrated as we speak on U.S. 29-cent stamps. The idea that black people had a share in the winning of the West, which racist movie directors in Hollywood have excluded from a fair account of this. Well, in actuality, it is true that blacks were a part of the conquest of the West. However, the part they played was largely punitive as a result of their role as U.S. cavalry soldiers punishing the American Indians. And ironically, because many of these black soldiers were these so-called buffalo soldiers, had been slaves of the Indians, they didn't really have a high opinion or a very lovable relationship with those Indians. So they were more than willing to participate in the Union Generals' War, and that's largely what the American war against the Indians was in the postbellum period, a war conducted by Union generals like Phil Sheridan and William Tecumseh Sherman with black troopers in their midst and in their ranks. And therefore, these Choctaw and Cherokee Indians, by the way, also had fought on the Confederacy. There were Confederate generals who were full-blooded Cherokee Indians because the Cherokee Indian identified with the white slaveholders who held blacks in bondage because Cherokee Indians also had plantations and also held blacks in bondage.
Incredible story, an incredible story. Now, how about this thing that there were free blacks that had white slaves?
Oh, yes. The early 17th century experience in America was one of, you would say, Reagan capitalism really prevailed in the 17th century in America. It was pretty much a capitalist domain, and it was an unregulated domain. And the idea that there was an ideology of white supremacy, which always protected poor white people and always gave them a higher station or status than blacks, is a tissue of falsehood. Because if you study the status of white slaves in Great Britain prior to the colonization and peopling of North America, you find that they were synonymous with a type of subhuman. That was the ideology of the ruling class in Great Britain. Now, that ideology didn't suddenly stop as soon as they confronted the experience of colonization in America. It was carried over. So there was a sense among the British aristocracy, who were now the governors of the crown colonies in British America, that if blacks were holding some individual whites in slavery or bondage, well, what the heck? These were, after all, poor whites, and this was their natural state. To the credit, I certainly don't wish to indict all wealthy whites. I'm not engaged in the class warfare here. I come from a family that had a fairly affluent background, so I don't have any axe to grind. It's just that this is what the facts, the documentary record, the empirical facts speak, and I must therefore be the vessel of their articulation. But there was finally a law passed. If you look at Henning's history of the statutes of Virginia, they actually had to pass a law saying that no black or Indian shall hold a Christian in bondage. Well, Christian was a euphemism for white person. So that's one of the pieces of evidence that we know. Because, you know, they came to be very ashamed and embarrassed. The record of white enslavement is not something that they wanted to broadcast to the world. It was something that existed in a kind of an anomalous and ambiguous fashion, and one has to hunt these things out. Now, I'm not saying that it's something that was in code, but if we see a law that says no Indian or black shall hold Christians in bondage, we have to understand that these were people who were very reluctant to pass a great deal of laws. The people at that time felt, those who were religiously inclined, felt that the Ten Commandments were plenty of laws. If they passed a law, you can be sure that it was because there was a need for it.
Mm-hmm.